They say that 1 in 8 people on this planet own a car, but there are some who are driving on borrowed time. That's this week on Motoring 2002.
TSN's Motoring 2002 is brought to you by Quaker State Motor Oils, formulated for the vehicles you drive and the way you drive them. And Midas. Keep a good thing going. Go Midas.
The scientists figured out a way to make gasoline explode in a relatively controlled manner. Coincidentally, they were developing materials that could contain that explosion without turning into a grenade.
Okay, you're probably asking, what is Jim Kenzie doing on that stage in front of all those people without his soapbox? We'll stick around and we'll find out what he's up to later on. But first, we're going to begin by meeting some people who probably don't watch this program. The reason, well, let's put it this way, cars are not exactly their favorite mode of transportation or anything else that pollutes our environment. And you know, it's hard to argue with that. But you know, these same people would admit that cars can be convenient, but they still don't want to rent and they definitely don't want to own. So what's their solution? How about sharing?
Hello, AutoShare. Okay, we're like an hourly car rental club. And you would...
AutoShare is about using a car sustainably in a city. Toronto's got a great transit system, and the whole idea is to make better use of it and to use a car when it makes the most sense, not to go basically the same route that the subway is going, or you know, if you can do something on your bike or walk, why not do that and just use a car when you really need a car.
It was a great opportunity to be part of a growing small company, a growing company, but one that kind of has a bit of an environmental conscience. Do you know what I mean? You feel good about yourself when you're working with AutoShare because you know that the ultimate goal is not just to put cheap wheels on the road for people when they need them, but ultimately we're taking people out of cars, people are driving less, and that has a huge impact on our environment here in Toronto.
Name and address, please.
I found out about AutoShare from friends who are environmentalists, and they knew even before the company had set up in Toronto that it was coming, so we had been alerted about it. And then we also found out, going to different events, they had started to hand out flyers and pamphlets about it. So if we can avoid owning a car, then we're not taking up the space of having a car and, you know, contributing to the pollution and things of renting a car continuously. Nevertheless, we still need cars on occasion. We have to move, Peter has to move all his tools around. And I've got to move a lot of books and papers and giant banker's boxes and boxes of books and papers. So you occasionally do really have to have a vehicle.
I chose to use AutoShare instead of owning my own car because for two reasons. One, the first was cost. That always the insurance and even to buy a secondhand car was close to double what AutoShare now is for me. And then the second one was for environmental reasons, to basically avoid putting 2 or 3 tons of carbon dioxide in the air if I own my own car. AutoShare is perfect for somebody who doesn't need the car to commute every day.
AutoShare has been very convenient because we've always been living on a subway line, and there are many, many AutoShares at all different subway stations around the city, and usually quite close to where we've been living, which is very convenient. And you have to phone ahead, so you need to be able to plan properly. But once you can plan, then you can phone up and book a car. Sometimes you can get one on the spur of the moment, but not always. But you can get it certainly if you plan ahead, and you can arrange for a car, and then you just go over to the lot and pick up the car and go.
Right now we have a little over 650 members sharing a fleet of 38 cars, and they're stationed across the city from High Park to the beach, and we tend to station our cars really close to transit stops. So it really facilitates moving from one mode of transportation to another.
I would say that AutoShare is a very good way to try to help you plan and organize your schedule and to not use a car continuously, but to have one available when you need it, if you've been able to plan ahead, and to be able to save money on not having to own a car and not having to find a place to park it and not having to deal with all the hassles and inconvenience and expense of continual maintenance, and also to feel that you are able to access a vehicle and use it, but without having to own a car and run one all the time.
Singing in the rain, I'm singing in the rain. All right, I don't know enough to come out of the rain, but I'm not the only one out here. More later on Kenzie's Corner. La da 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 da. Rolling.
You know, back in the early 90s, the Americans enjoyed a natty little number called the SER. It was a derivative of the Sentra. Sometimes the wheels come off the wagon. Back in the early 90s, the Americans enjoyed a natty little number called the Sentra SER. This week on Test Drive, we take a look at the reincarnation of that nameplate. This is the Sentra SER SpecV. That original SER came with 140 horsepower beneath its hood. Now at the time, this was nothing short of spectacular. The latest car to wear the badge continues the trend as the SpecV comes with a 175 horsepower motor courtesy of the Ultima. As well as bringing abundant pony power, the 2.5 litre 4 dishes out 180 pounds-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. The result is, quite frankly, the best the small car market has to offer. To reach 100 kilometers an hour, it takes but 7.5 seconds. However, it is in the mid-range where the engine truly comes to the fore. Once through 80 kilometers an hour, the SpecV takes off and puts highly illegal speeds on the clock, and in very short order. Now, if you value your driver's license, take the warning. One of the items you get with the SpecV is a limited slip front diff. Now, it's got its good points and its bad. On the good side, you don't feel the action through the steering wheel, and in the dry, it really does cut down on the amount of wheel spin. However, in the wet, it's quite another matter. When this wheel begins to spin, the limited slip diff does its thing, forcing the power to the other wheel, which in turn forces it to spin. At that point in time, with both wheels spinning, you've got no control of the steering. And what happens is you develop torque drift, and the front of the car begins to wander left and right. Now, if it only happened in first gear, you could live with it, but it doesn't. It happens in first, second, and if there's enough water on the road, and because of these summer radials, it can happen in third gear, at which point in time you're talking about significant speed. In my view, it's as much a liability as it is a benefit. The only transmission offered is a slick shifting 6-speed manual. The throws are short, the gate nicely defined, and the clutch light progressive. The other place the Sentra shines is in the handling department. With McPherson struts up front and a derivative of the Maxima's multi-link beam in back, the SER benefits from roll bars at both ends. Compared to the base car, the SpecV gets stiffer springs, 15% stiffer up front and 16 in back, as well as high-performance 215/45 ZR17 tyres. The resulting car carved its way through the pylon test with surprising alacrity. Understeer and body roll are very well controlled, and so is the transition from left to right as you approach the limit, meaning little drama. Add to that the firm and precise steering, and the Sentra will stay with any of its intended competition. Now, be that in a straight line drag or through the twisty bits. If you take the SpecV with the optional package, you get a power moonroof, a great sounding radio that comes with a monstrous subwoofer in the trunk. You also get a good set of climate controls that does a good job of blowing the air throughout the cabin, as well as power locks, windows, mirrors, and steering wheel mounted cruise control. But then you find the things that trip up. First of all, the gauges, whilst they're reasonably accurate, well, they're very gaudy to the eye. And then you get to the seat fabric. Well, quite frankly, this stuff looks like a cross between fishnet stockings and the bordello they belong in. Comments on the cloth aside, the seats are comfortable and the support about right without being confining. On the safety front, the SER brings second-generation airbags, 3-point belts in all positions, with the front belts getting both pre-tensioners and force limiters. On the active side, anti-lock brakes are available as an option. With Nissan charging an arm and most of the leg, it should be standard equipment. Nevertheless, when equipped with ABS, the stopping distances are short, measuring just 112 feet from 80 kilometers an hour. It's also one of the better systems, as it remains dormant until really needed. This Sentra SER is a very nice vehicle, but I'm not convinced about the SpecV version, primarily because it costs almost 24 grand. For a little under 21,000, you can get the SER. Mind you, it comes with one fewer gears, no limited slip diff, and only 165 horsepower. Imagine that, I'm saying only 165. So if you do shop, I'd go for the SER and not this SpecV.
Our Midas tip of the week concerns wiper motors in GM cars and light trucks. When a GM vehicle comes in with non-functional wipers, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that you need a whole new wiper motor, but that's not always the case. This little circuit board is often the cause of the problem. Here's the whole wiper motor, and underneath this little cover on the front of the wiper motor is where this circuit board lives. This circuit board is often the cause of wiper motor failure on a GM vehicle. This board is a pretty easy deal to change. Just a couple of screws required to access it, and 9 times out of 10, failure of this wiper board is the cause of the problem. Now, a whole wiper motor would fix the problem, but this $60 board is much easier to change, and it'll save you a lot of money if that really is the problem. A new wiper motor can cost you $200 to $300, and it's considerably more labor. Check this first. That's your Midas tip of the week.
It looks just like the turbo from the front, the aggressive wide body and the enlarged air intakes. Looks very aggressive. It looks very much like a race car, if you will. So it resembles the turbo from the front. 320 horsepower with the VarioCam Plus variable valve timing system, which enhances engine performance in all gears.
$2 billion. That's approximately what it costs to design, tool up, build a factory, and get ready to build an automobile. The second through 800,000th car cost about 49 cents. But that first one cost $2 billion. So you better guess right. And if you wonder why car companies tend to be conservative, that's the exact reason.
Basically what this is a conference for fleet managers from across North America and even as far as Puerto Rico. And it's sessions on car technologies, the car marketplace. We're also trying to educate our people more in the management systems, computer systems. So it's a very wide variety. Today our guest speaker is Jim Kenzie, and he's talking about future vehicle technology. So he basically covered the past of the vehicle to the future, where it stands today, what we've evolved to, where we're going to. Very interesting, very informative session.
The fleets are bought in bulk by companies or by government organizations. The largest fleet in Canada is the Armed Forces. But companies like Kraft or Bell or whatever will buy hundreds of vehicles for various needs. The car companies all have fleet sales organizations which sell these cars. It's obviously a big deal if you can sell 300 cars in one transaction. It's a big deal. They get good discounts on them. You may remember the popular screwdriver magazines, Popular Science, Popular Mechanics back in the 50s. This is what they thought we'd be driving now. We'd all be flying to work in helicopter cars. We'd have backpacks with jet thingies on there, and we'd fly back and forth. This hasn't happened, but that's what they thought the future was going to hold. These people are fleet managers who look after fleets of cars from corporations, government enterprises, and whatnot, and they have to be aware of what's coming up in the next 15, 20 years, how it's going to affect their business. So I was talking about some of the new advances in transmissions, materials, structures, engine, powertrain, traffic management systems, and things like that. This is also late-breaking news. Ferdinand Piëch, who is the retiring chairman of Volkswagen, drove this vehicle from the company headquarters in Wolfsburg to the shareholders meeting in Hamburg, a distance of about 149 miles, I think it was. He got 0.89 liters per 100 kilometers, which in US gallons translates to 253 miles to the gallon.
We used Jim about 2 years ago at the Nashville FMI. He was fabulous. We had to bring him back.
Well, Jim is still on stage doing what he does best, as we all know, and that, of course, is talking. But later on, they tell me there'll be another presentation on fleet maintenance vis-a-vis the environment. Now, is that really a big deal, you ask? Well, consider this. The fleet business in North America alone represents over 3.2 million vehicles. All right, now let's head to the Quaker State Garage and join Bill Gardner.
Brad, you notice how in the automotive industry the last 10 years or so, everybody talks about maintenance. Nobody's car has to be repaired or anything replaced, just maintenance. It kind of gives the buyer the idea that it's just a little adjustment and there's going to be really cheap, eh? I got news for you, boys. Anyhow, we've got an email to answer this week from one of our viewers, John Patterson in Kelowna, British Columbia. He's got a problem. He's going to need more than maintenance on this car. He's got a Pontiac Firebird with a V6 engine, 160,000 kilometers on it. And he says that he overheated the car badly, blew the rad. Subsequently, he replaced the rad and then found water in the oil. In other words, coolant getting into the crankcase oil, which is not an uncommon condition on today's cars. He followed this up by machining the cylinder heads, in other words, disassembling the engine, machining the heads, replacing the head bolts, head gaskets, intake gaskets, valve cover gaskets, etc. He also replaced the thermostat, torqued all the engine castings down to specs, and after he got it back together, had the same situation where the crankcase was getting contaminated, the crankcase oil was getting contaminated with coolant from the cooling system. Now, a lot of modern cars share this problem. However, his problem was that when he disassembled the engine, he didn't pay close attention to the parts that were coming out. He didn't look closely at those gaskets to make sure that he'd found the root cause of his problem. Now, a veteran mechanic would have been able to look at the gaskets as they came out of that engine and determine if there was in fact a blown gasket. If you don't see a blown gasket, you've got to look at the castings involved in the engine. The cylinder head casting, like this one I've got beside me, is often the problem with coolant leaks. Now, it could be a crack in the block or in one of the heads on this engine, but in any case, if you don't find a blown gasket, you've got to look further, and this is where you enlist the services of a qualified automotive machine shop. You're going to take the cylinder heads and or the engine block to the machine shop and have them crack checked. Now, depending on what type of material is used, and some blocks and heads are aluminum and some are cast iron, depending on the material involved will depend on the crack detection process that the machine shop is going to use. But it's not something that the average mechanic like myself or a do-it-yourselfer can do. We've got to enlist the machine shop. So it's off to the machine shop with the appropriate castings that you've removed from the engine, get them checked for cracks. When we sent this one out, there were a number of cracks in it. The machine shop highlighted them with some yellow paint right here, and in this case we had to replace the cylinder head. Now, that isn't always required. Sometimes you can exchange the cylinder head for another one that's already had the crack repaired. There's welding processes and different ways they can repair these things and put them back into service. But you can't just blindly go forward and put the engine back together without identifying the problem, because you could run into the same thing that John ran into. You've got the same problem, and you've spent a lot of money on labor and gaskets, and you've got to go through the whole thing again. So be careful when you're doing this job and get it checked thoroughly by a machine shop. Till next week, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 2002.
For more information on past and future episodes of Motoring, log on to the Motoring website at motoringtv.com, where you can email your suggestions, questions, and comments, which are always welcome. That's motoringtv.com.
not great weather for making pretty pictures on television. But you know, as I was driving in today, I couldn't believe how many people didn't have their lights on in this kind of weather. What are you, nuts? The second worst thing about driving in the rain after the lack of traction is the lack of visibility. It's not just the rain itself, but the spray kicked up by the road. And yet a lot of cars are out there with no lights at all. Now in Canada, for the last 10 years or so, car companies have been required to use daytime running lights, so your headlights are switched on automatically. But surely on the highway, it's more important for the rear lights to be on too. Now, of course, the law doesn't demand that the car companies do it that way, so of course they're too cheap to look after your safety properly. And the government doesn't know enough to make the law the way it should be. So it's up to you. Now, in New York State, they recently passed the law that if your wipers are on, your headlights have to be on too. In other words, it's up to you. But even so, you shouldn't have to rely on your car company or your government to keep you safe. Take responsibility for yourself. Switch those headlights on. Do what I do. Turn the car on, turn the headlights on. Daytime, nighttime, rain or shine, doesn't matter. You got a lot of idiot drivers out there on the road, like that guy beeping at us when we're trying to make television here. You got to take responsibility for your own safety. Oh, by the way, that's headlights and tail lights only. Fog lights, they don't even work in the fog. They only make you look like a jerk. I'm Jim Kenzie.
Well, we've discovered this week that there is indeed another side to Jim Kenzie. Of course, each week we see him as we just did on the corner, but we've also seen Jim as an educator. And although you may not always agree with his opinions, you have to agree he certainly knows the industry. And if you ever want to contact Jim or anybody else on the program, check out our webpage at motoringtv.com. Well, that's it for now. We'll see you next time out as we continue to bring you more stories about cars and the people who drive them.
Basically what I wanted to show was that there was no limits to where Cadillac can go. We know where it's been and we're proud of our heritage, but what would really catch the public's imagination, what would really show where Cadillac is, where it wants to be.
TSN's Motoring 2002 has been brought to you by Quaker State Motor Oils, formulated for the vehicles you drive and the way you drive them. And Midas. Keep a good thing going. Go Midas.